Okay, here we are, Masech the Sukkah, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. This Perek presents more halachas about the mitzvah of living in a sukkah, Teishvu Keim Taduru. Mishnah Aleph discusses the following. Hayoshen Tachas Hamita Basukah Leyotzei Dechevosei. One who sleeps under a bed in a kosher sukkah wasn't yet his chiv of sukkah. The primary mitzvah of sukkah is to eat, drink, and to sleep there. Although the Mishnah mentions only sleeping, the same halacha would apply to one who eats or drinks under the bed. And Amr Yehuda. The reason is because the bed is considered a roof that creates a hefsek or a mechitza between him and the schach. This halacha doesn't apply unless the underside of the bed is at least 10 tefachim above the ground. For only then can it be considered an independent roof. This case is similar to that of a person sleeping on a four-poster bed covered by a sheet, which we mentioned in the first paragraph, which also doesn't fulfill its obligation because he's under a roof. Rabbi Yehuda said, it was our practice that we would sleep under the bed in the sukkah in the presence of his kenim. And they didn't say anything to us in protest, so that implies that one who sleeps under a bed is yaitze his chiyuv. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah is a diras keva. A bed, on the other hand, is arai, since it's moved from place to place. Because the bed is arai and the sukkah is keva, the roof formed by the bed has no significance compared to the schach of the sukkah. Therefore, according to Yehuda, one who sleeps under the bed is still considered to be in the sukkah and is yaitze his chiyuv. The Tanakama, though, holds that a sukkah is diras arai, just like the bed. Since the sukkah itself is arai, the schach doesn't render the roof of the bed insignificant. Someone under the bed is thus viewed as being sheltered by the bed, which creates a hefsek, a mechitza between him and the schach. Reb Shimon said, there was an incident in which Tavi, Reb Gamliel's Eved Kanani, was sleeping under a bed in the sukkah. Reb Gamliel said to this Kanim, Risam Tavi Abdi, have you seen how wisely my slave Tavi behaves? He's a Talmud Chacham who knows that Avodim are part of the mitzvah of sukkah, because the Eved Kanani is a guy that was acquired by a Jew. He's obligated to perform all the mitzvahs that are not limited to a specific time, meaning he's mechuyev in all the mitzvahs. He's mechuyev in all the mitzvahs that a woman would be mechuyev in, which would pater then mitzvahs aseshas magrama that are limited to a specific time. He's therefore pater from the mitzvah of sukkah, which is a mitzvah that only applies in the yontiv of sukkahs. So why does he sleep under the bed? He sleeps under the bed in order to make room for those who are mechuyev. Since Tavi was pater from the mitzvah, he didn't have to sleep on the bed. He chose instead to sleep under the bed so there'd be room for other people to fulfill the mitzvah, as it states in Yerushalmi. And based on this comment which Reb Gamliel made in casual conversation, Reb Gamliel's purpose in making the statement was not necessarily to teach this halacha, but just to pride himself in his slave that he was a Talmud Chacham. So we learn in passing that one who sleeps under a bed in a sukkah was not yaitze his chiyuv. And the Gemara says that from here we see that afilu sichas chulin shel talmidei chachamim tzrichen limud, that even the regular mundane, so to speak, conversations of talmidei chachamim require a deep understanding, because from that we can understand halachas from the things that they're talking about. Mishnah Beis, Hasomer Sukkah Bekari Hamita Ksheira. If one supports a schach of a sukkah with the boards of a bed, the bed is outside the sukkah and the schach is supported by one of the ends of the bed frame. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the sukkah cannot stand on its own without the support of the bed, it's possible because it's not as sturdy as required. The sukkah will not remain standing for long because the bed is likely to be moved, which we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, that a bed is a davar hametaltel, and it's something arai, it's not keva, which would then cause the sukkah to collapse. It's therefore possible, according to Yehuda, who holds that a sukkah diras keva be'inon. The Tanakama, however, holds that it's kosher a sukkah because, in his opinion, a sukkah is meant to be a diras arai, temporary, not diras keva. Sukkah hamduvlalas, a sukkah that has more sunlight than shade because its schach is uneven, meaning instead of the schach being laid in one flat layer, it's split into two layers, which with every other piece of schach at one height and all the remaining pieces at another height. And a sukkah whose schach is very sparse, yet its shade is greater than its sunlight. Ksheira. In each of these cases, it's still a good sukkah. the shaila is why. In the first case, where the schach is uneven, the sukkah is valid because we view the schach as though it were flat. During most of the day, when the sun shines on the sukkah at an angle, the sukkah has more sunlight than shade because the light shines through the gaps between the two levels of schach. The sukkah is nevertheless valid at all times because schach is judged by how much shade it provides when the sun is directly overhead. Since at that time the sukkah has more shade than sunlight, it's valid even during the rest of the day. In the second case, where the schach is sparse, the sukkah is valid because the solid parts of the schach cover a greater area than the gaps. You don't have a problem of perutza meruba la'omed, you have omed meruba la'parutz, meaning you have more schach than empty space. The Mishnah teaches that even though the schach is so thin and sparse that it can easily be blown away by the wind, the sukkah is valid as long as it has more tzeil than chama. When the Mishnah says tzeil and chama, it doesn't refer to the shadows and sunlit areas on the floor of the sukkah, but to the solid schach material and gaps on the top of the sukkah. If it were referring to the shadows and the sun on the floor, it would not require shade to be greater than the sunlight, for even if they were equal, the sukkah would be kosher. The next case, Hamu'uba Kimin Bayis, a sukkah that's so densely covered with schach, it's like a house. Even though the stars cannot be seen from it, it is kosher, even though the schach resembles the roof of a house, which midday rise is no good for a sukkah. The Chachamim did not passel this case. It is preferable, though, that the schach be laid in such a way that the stars can be seen through it. This is where the quote-unquote Meshakas comes from, that you have to be able to see the stars through the sukkah. I don't think there's a specific Indian to be able to see the stars, but it's an idea that it has to, that if it's Mu'uba Kimin Bayis, it's on its way to being much more keva than not. Okay. Mishnah Gimel. Ha'oitza sukkasa b'roisha ha'gala, if someone makes a sukkah on top of a wagon, or b'roisha svina, or on top of the boat at the sea, kshera, it's kosher because despite its instability, it's considered a dwelling place. Although a sukkah on a wagon can be moved from place to place, and a sukkah on a boat at sea can be blown down by the average sea wind, they are regarded as places where people would dwell. Despite the fact that they're dwellings of temporary nature, it's a diras arai. There are kosher sukkahs, since a sukkah is meant to be a diras arai in any event. However, the sukkah on a boat must be strong enough to be able to withstand an average wind on land, which is weaker than the average wind at sea, because otherwise it wouldn't be considered even a temporary dwelling. V'oilun labi yantif, and you may go up into it on yantif. I mean, this is obvious. Obviously, what's the question over here? The reason why the Mishnah said it, because the next part of the Mishnah is that if you have a sukkah b'reisha ilan al gabe gamal ein oilun labi yantif. B'reisha ilan, if one makes a sukkah on top of a tree, he constructed a floor on the tree, built walls around it, and covered them with schach. Obviously, that the tree is not covering the schach of the sukkah. Oil gabe gamal, around the back of the camel. He built walls between the camel's humps and covered them with schach. Ksher, it's a kosher sukkah, ve'ein oilun labi yantif, but he may not go up on it on yantif because it's forbidden to use a tree or the body of a living animal on yantif, which is a isur midrabbanon on Shabbos or yantif, because they were concerned that one might pull off a branch, which is asur midaraisa. So it's a shvus together not to be over any melachas or Shabbos or yantif deraisa. Similarly, they ask using the body of a living animal on Shabbos and yantif because one might pull off a tree branch with which he'll use to prod the animal to move. For this reason, one may not use a sukkah that's supported by a tree or an animal. The sukkah itself, however, is valid and may be used on Chol Hamoed. These isurim of shvus do not apply on Chol Hamoed, which is interesting because the Gemara on Daf Tes and Sukkah does talk about a sukkah having to be kosher all the days of yantif. But over here, it's not that there's a psul in the sukkah. The sukkah is in a place that's not accessible for you on yantif, so it doesn't take away. I mean, the sukkah is still roy. It doesn't take away from the fact that you can't use it the first days. It's not that you can't use it because there's a psul in the sukkah, but again, you can't use it because it's not accessible in a yantif takeaway. Shtayim be'ilan va'achas b'dei. If two walls of the sukkah rest on the tree, and one is man-made, which is built on the ground, meaning the sukkah has three walls, two of the walls and most of the floor rest on the tree. The third wall is a tall board that stands on the ground and it supports the sukkah floor and rises above it. On that side, the sukkah rests on a ground-based wall rather than a tree. So in such a case, or two walls are man-made, built on the ground, one rests on the tree. The sukkah is kosher, but we may not go up into it on yantiv, since neither of these two sukkahs would remain standing if the tree were taken away. Going up into them means using the tree, which is usher on Yantif. Shalosh b'dei adam achas be'ilan. However, if the sukkah has 4 walls, 3 of which are man-made, built on the ground, and 1 rests on the tree, ksheira v'ailan la b'yantif. The sukkah is valid, and you may go up on it on Yantif. In this case, where the sukkah is supported by 3 walls and is built on the ground, it doesn't need a support of the tree at all. Therefore, one who goes up into the sukkah is not considered to be using the tree. However, one may not climb up the tree because that would be direct use of the tree itself. Rather, one must access the sukkah by some other means, such as a ladder. Zeh haklal, this is the rule, this is the bottom line. In every case where the sukkah is built in such a way that even if the tree were removed, it would stand on its own, it's valid and you may go up on it in Yantif. The Mishnah adds this rule to teach that even if the sukkah has only 2 walls based on the ground, but they are opposite each other and not next to each other at right angles, the sukkah may be used in Yantif since it would remain standing even if the tree were taken away. Mishnah Dalet. If one makes a sukkah on a patch of ground between the trees, and the trees are its walls, it's a kashrus sukkah. In this case, the sukkah is not supported by the trees at all. You're using the trees as walls. So dwelling this sukkah is mutter on Yantif, and it's not being over on the Yisad Rabbanan of using a tree on Shabbos or Yantif. Okay. At this point, even though it's in the middle of a Mishnah, the Mishnayos stop dealing with the how to build a sukkah, but it's the people, turns to the mitzvah of yeshiva sukkah. So the Mishnah now presents situations where one would be patur for the mitzvah of sukkah. Shluchei mitzvah p'tur min sukkah. People who are traveling in order to perform a mitzvah, such as pidyon shvuyim, are patur from the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah because someone who's engaged in one mitzvah does not have to perform another mitzvah. That rule is called ha'isik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. People traveling to do a mitzvah are patur from dwelling in the sukkah even at night when they stop to lodge and they're not actively traveling. Since they're mentally occupied with the mitzvah, even then, they need not divert their attention from it to go and dwell in a sukkah. You see how much focus and concentration, people had doing mitzvahs, and people should have doing mitzvahs. This is a very big sugya. It's very gishmak sugya in the Gemara. Hopefully we'll get to discuss it one day as well. Sick people and their attendants are part of the mitzvah of sukkah. Sick people are part of because they're uncomfortable in the sukkah. The Torah says by sukkah's teshu, which is understood to mean that the way one dwells in a sukkah during the Yantiv of sukkah should resemble the way one dwells in his house the rest of the year. Teshu kein taduru, which is the understanding of how the sukkah should be built and the way that you sit in the sukkah. So according to this halacha, if a person is experiencing a situation that would make him leave his home, he's parted from staying in a sukkah. During the year, a sick person wouldn't remain in his home. If he can move to another place where he would feel better or more comfortable, so he's not mechuyev to stay in the sukkah either. So, and the Misham Sheyem and their attendants are also parted from the sukkah because they're taking care of the sick person, and that would be nichlal in the mitzvah of Bikur Chaylim, so that would part them from the mitzvah of sukkah. We may eat and drink casually, that we may consume a small amount of food or drink as a snack outside the sukkah. Even a person would eat to relieve his hunger, which was obviously not replace a regular meal. Since a person would eat a snack outside his home, he may do so outside the sukkah. I think we said this ma'aser earlier that someone told the Chazon Ish that there's a certain Rebbe that doesn't leave his sukkah the whole Yantif. He's talking about how attached to the mitzvah of sukkah, so the Chazon Ish said it's a jail. Your house, you go in and out. Teshuva Kin Tadur. Obviously try to chop around the mitzvah as much as you can. But the ikar is that it should be Teshuva Kin Tadur. It should be uncomfortable. You shouldn't feel like you're being held hostage in the sukkah. Because that wouldn't be, every mitzvah, as Rebbe just said, it pumped fears ice this way in the mitzvah of sukkah, that it's Teshuva Kin Tadur, that there has to be a certain geshmak in the mitzvah. Really, all the mitzvahs are like that the mitzvahs have to be done with the geshmak, as we talk all the time. Okay, Mishnah Hey. It happened once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was brought a cooked dish just to taste. Rabbi Gamliel was brought 2 dates and a pail of water. Fruit and water are considered achilas aray no matter what amount. You could always eat that outside of sukkah, I guess, even if it's going to be from Shivas Haminim. The Amru Halum La Sukkah, they said, take them up to the sukkah. In those times, sukkahs were commonly built on roofs, which is why they said to take the food and water up to the sukkah. And as is mashma, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Allah said, the Goyim are going to have kindness on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They didn't give us a chance. He didn't give us an opportunity to do any mitzvahs. So Kadosh Baruch Hu gives them the mitzvah of sukkah. He said mitzvah kala, mitzvah sukkah, and they go build sukkahs on their roofs. Right? It's interesting. Maybe we could speculate a little bit about why they made the sukkah, why we make sukkahs on our roof. Throughout Nach we find that they were very busy with putting away the zaras on the roof. So they would the goyim, by replacing the sukkah with the avodah zara, will show that they're sort of doing tshuva on the avodah zara that they would have on the roof. But I don't know. I'm sorry, the Mishnah tells these stories to teach that if a person eats a snack inside the sukkah, he's not considered to be a balgaiva, but to the contrary, he is worthy to be praised. Right? Because b'derech klal, if there's a chumrah and people do it, so maybe they're doing it to show off. Right? As we know from, like Kalareita Lita Hashem Yita, as the Gemara, as the Mishnah says at the end of the second parak of Brachas, and the Gemara in Pesachim in the fourth parak discusses this barichos. But the idea is like this: then in the sukkah, it's like lechatchila to eat everything in the sukkah. Either things that you want to eat outside the sukkah, that's fine. Also, chilas ara is muter chutz sukkah. Okay, weiter. When they gave Reb Tzadok food that was smaller than the volume of an egg, not lebamapa, he didn't wash his hands, but he took it with a cloth. Although a person must wash his hands before eating bread, mitzvah netilas yadayim, Reb Tzadok holds that one doesn't need to do so unless the amount of bread is at least the size of a kebeya. Because he didn't wash his hands, he held the bread in a cloth for the sake of cleanliness. And he ate it outside the sukkah. That's very interesting. So this was it was a food, let's say bread, that was smaller than the shear of an egg. He ate it outside the sukkah. So here the Mishnah teaches that it's acceptable for even a Talmid Chacham to eat achilas aray outside the sukkah, which is mutar la'alocha, and it's not considered to be a deficiency in one's observance of the mitzvahs. And he didn't say birkas hamazon after eating this bread. There's a machlekes tanoim whether the minimum amount of bread that requires birkas hamazon is the size of an olive or the size of a kebeya. The Rebbe Tzadok follows the shita that the minimum is a kebeya. That's why he didn't bench afterwards. Now, you have to bench where you eat. So if you eat it outside the sukkah, you would bench outside the sukkah. I don't think there's a specific chiyuv that you have to bench in the sukkah more than anything else. Mishnah Vav, Rebbe Lezer says, Arba Esrei Sudas Chayv Odom Lechel Basukah Achas B'Yom Achas B'Layla. A person must eat a total of 14 meals in the sukkah over the course of the 7 days of Yom Tov, one during the day and one during the night. As we mentioned, the way one is Mekayim the mitzvah of Yeshiva Sukkah during the Yom Tov of Sukkah should resemble the way one dwells in his house the rest of the year. Rebbe Lezer holds, therefore, since a person usually eats one meal during the day and one meal at night when he's living at home, he must do the same in the sukkah. Meaning, it's not the halacha isn't because it's yantif and you're mechuyev to eat a sudas yantif. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying fakert, because on a regular day you eat at least one meal during the day and at least one meal during the night, then you have to have a minimum of those sudas in your sukkah. The Chachamim say there's no fixed requirement. If one doesn't want to eat any meals in the sukkah, he's not mechuyev to do so. The Chachamim say that there's no set number of meals one must eat in the sukkah. If one chooses to fast or to eat only snacks, he's not mechuyev to eat in the sukkah at all. The chiyuv of a sukkah is only if he wants to eat a meal, he must do so in the sukkah. The Chachamim are meidet Rebbe Lezer that dwelling in a sukkah should be like dwelling in a house, but they draw the opposite conclusion from this rule. They argue that just as a person living in his house can choose whether or not to eat a meal, the same is true for a person dwelling in the sukkah. Now the Pasha says that people normally eat, so that would be the normal situation. La halacha, it is necessary to eat in the sukkah because one is mechuyev to eat sudas on Shabbos and Yontif. And when one's mechuyev to eat a meal, he must eat it in the sukkah. However, the chiyuv to eat these meals results out of the chiyuv to eat a suda on Shabbos and Yontif, and not from the chiyuv mitzvah sukkah. To fulfill the mitzvah sukkah, there's no need to eat any meals. Ein la davar kitzvah chutz milei Yom Tov Rishon shel Chag bilvad, except on the first night of Yom Tov when a meal in the sukkah is mechuyev. Why? Zog the Rab, Delfina chamisha asa michag hamatzos. This is very famous, probably definitely one of the most famous Gzera Shabbos, that says chamisha asa by Pesach, and it says chamisha asa by Sukkos, just like by Pesach we're mechuyev to eat a kazayis matzah on Tezvav. so too you're mechuyev to eat a kedais of bread, challah, in the sukkah because of tezvav. You may even need to eat it at kedei chilas pras, and there's other shilas and other halachas that revolve around this, but the ikar is that you have to have a kezayis of, at least a kezayis of challah in the sukkah to be yikes of the mitzvah. Now the issue becomes, and it was very exciting a few years ago when there was a Mishunidige hurricane storms over here. I think it was last Sukkot. It would be Tavshin Peidalid Sukkot. Arab Sukkot was tremendous floods all over Brooklyn, and there was a big shiloh what to do because you couldn't eat in the sukkah. Everything was sobbing wet and pouring, and most people's sukkahs many sukkahs didn't even stay standing. But l'mayz al halacha, you have to eat in the sukkah anyway. So you eat a kazayis, you go back inside. Now, Rabbi Lezer later changed his mind and agreed that only the meal of the first night is chiyuv. However, he disagreed with the Chachamim on a different point. And here the Mishnah continues. Rabbi Lezer says further, someone who didn't eat in the sukkah on the first day of Yom Tov should make this up by eating extra food on any other day of the Yom Tov, including in the last night, which would mean the night of Shmini Atzeres. Rabbi Lezer learns this out from the halacha of Karban Chagiga, which one must bring on the first days of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. The halacha is that if one failed to bring the Chagiga on the first day of Pesach or Shavuos, he can make up for his failure to do so by bringing it on one of the next 6 days. And in the case of Sukkot, he can bring the offering even on Shmini Atzeres, as we state in the first parak in Chagiga. According to Rabbi Lezer, the same halacha applies to the Sudas of the first night of Sukkot. If he missed the Suda, he can make it up by eating extra food on any of the remaining days of the Yom Tov, including Shmini Atzeres. So the Chachamim saying no. In Ladavat Hashlumen, this matter has no compensation. If he didn't eat a meal in the sukkah on the first night, he can't make it up afterwards. Al Nemar, regarding this matter, it says in the pasuk in Keheles, Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskoin, chisaron lo yuchal himanois, a twisted thing that cannot be straightened and a missing thing that cannot be counted. Just interesting that we know we lay in Keheles on Sukkos, and the many times given, amongst them, the Simcha Mazuaisa. What's the tachlis of rejoicing? And because we're coming after a whole month of special mitzvahs that we have only at that time of the year and no other time, to show that the Irker Simcha is only the Simcha in doing the mitzvahs and doing the Ras Hashem. Mishnah Zayin. If someone's head and most of his body are inside the sukkah, but his table is inside the house, which would mean outside the sukkah, Beshame ruled that this arrangement is no good, because you might accidentally lean over the table and eat it outside the sukkah. But Beis Hillel say that it's a kosher sukkah because they're not concerned for this possibility. Now, what's the machlekes? What are we talking about? Besham and Beis Hillel disagree about two cases. Number one, you have a very large sukkah. If a person's in a large sukkah, that he eats from the table outside the sukkah, so Besham say he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah midrabanan, right? Which the Rabbeinu Yoina in the beginning of Brachas brings that the Chacham have a koyach to tell you to do a mitzvah asay in a certain way, and if you don't do it that specific way, the way that they require it, you're not going to be able to chiyuv, right? And they said that about saying Kriyishma Shal Arvis after Chatzos, because really midiraisa it's still perfectly fine to say Kriyishma after Chatzos, and Beis Hillel say obviously that it's fine. Now, we could also be talking about a small sukkah, if the sukkah is so small that it could only hold the man's head and most of his body, but not his table. Beis Shammai say that the sukkah is no good midrabanan, while Beis Hillel say it is good. Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, did it not happen that the elders of Beis Shammai and the elders of Beis Hillel went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben Hachironi, and they found him sitting with his head and most of his body inside the sukkah, but his table was inside the house. They didn't say anything to him in protest, which means that this shows that even the Ziknei Beis Shammai accepted his practice. Beis Shammai answered to Beis Hillel, you're bringing a proof from that Maisa, but they did tell him in protest. They did tell him, if this has always been your practice, you were never mekayim the mitzvah sukkah in all your days. That is, you weren't mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah with all the dinim derabanan. Midiraisa, it's fine, pashtos. But again, like we said, the alumnus over here is that the Chachamim have the koyach to tell you that a specific way to be mekayim a mitzvah saseh, and if you don't fulfill the mitzvah saseh that way, so then you're not going to be hurt to the chiyuv. Now, it was very interesting because when I was a kid, this Mishnah always bothered me. It says they went to visit him, so that means he was sick. Why else would they go visit him? And chaylas pata from sukkah. So it could be that they went to visit him even when he was sick, even though it's bechlal not the pashtos, right? And not necessarily were they telling him that you're not being able to the mitzvah of sukkah right now, but told him more theoretically that if this is how your sukkah always is, then you're not mechuyev, then you're not yotze the chiyuv. But it's very not the pashtos who says that they went to visit him when he was sick. Maybe they went to visit him because it's a mitzvah lahakbel pnei rabbi b'regel. There's a chiyuv. Al-Kaparim, there's a mitzvah for a person to visit his Rebbe on the Yontif. Okay. Mishnah Ches. Noshim avadim uktanim p'tur min hasukah. Women, avadim knanim, and minors under bar mitzvah are part of the mitzvah of sukkah. Kotam she'eni tzarich l'imay chayiv b'sukkah. However, a kotam doesn't need his mother's mechuyev to dwell in the sukkah because he's old enough to be trained to be mekayim the mitzvah of chinuch. Once a child is mature enough to perform a particular mitzvah, and the Rabbana, the father, is obligated to have him do the mitzvah. This is the obligation of a chinuch. The level of required maturity varies from one mitzvah to another. With regard to the mitzvah of sukkah, a child must be old enough to not need his mother. That is, a child sufficiently mature, then when he wakes up, he doesn't call for his mother repeatedly until she comes. Rather, he calls and then waits quietly for her and goes back to sleep, or doesn't go back to sleep. Only a child of this age needs to be trained to dwell in the sukkah because a younger child couldn't sleep to have his mother. And we just said that in Nashim are Pturim, so it wouldn't be there. It happened once that the daughter-in-law of Shammai Hazaken gave birth to a son, and he removed the plaster from the roof over her bed. Above the bed for the child, so it would be in a sukkah. Shammai the elder replaced the plaster in the roof, which is unfit for schach, with valid schach, creating a sukkah over and around the bed in which the newborn was sleeping. According to Shammai Hazaken, the mitzvah of chinuch applies even in the case where a child is not aware of it. As soon as he becomes capable of performing the mitzvah, in this case of sukkah, requiring only eating and sleeping, he must arrange for him to do so. Now, I think there's a chiddush over here in the Mishnah. Could be this is already spoken about, maybe even in the Gemara. But the previous Mishnah just finished the conversation between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about you don't think that if you make schach just over the bed that you may lean over and eat a little bit outside the sukkah or sleep a little bit outside the sukkah, so then maybe it doesn't, maybe it was doing this for like a lifnei mishur sadin, and not necessarily to be mekayim the ikar mitzvah, because be'etzem ikar adin midiraisa nashur avad mektanim reptur min sukkah. So yesh la'ayin b'zeh, but I think it's a good ha'ar. Mishnah test kol shavas hayamim adam oisei sukkosei keva ubeisei arai. During all the 7 days of Sukkot, a person should make a sukkah his permanent residence and his house his temporary residence. That is, he should eat, sleep, and relax in the sukkah. And one who owns beautiful utensils and linens should bring them into the sukkah. The Torah is mechayev us to live in the sukkah during the yontif of Sukkot in the same way that we live in our houses the whole rest of the year. Now, if it rains, one is parted from the mitzvah. This is also learned out from the pasuk of Teishu Kein to Duru, because if it's raining in your house, you wouldn't sit there under the rain. You would go at least to a different room. You wouldn't sleep in a place where it's raining on you. If the rain was falling, when does it become permitted to remove utensils and leave the sukkah? When it rains hard enough that a porridge made of split beans would be ruined. Porridge is easily ruined by rain, and a porridge of split beans is ruined even more easily than the other kinds of porridge. If enough rain is falling in the sukkah to ruin this mikvah, so then, even a person who is not actually eating this dish is part of the mitzvah, since it's distressing to eat any food under such conditions. The Chachamim describes this with a mashal, a story that can help us understand. So a servant who came with a pitcher of water to mix a cup of wine for his master. The master poured the pitcher in the servant's face, showing that he doesn't want the servant to serve him. Similarly, when Hashem brings rain on Sukkot and forces us to leave the Sukkah, He shows that He's not pleased with our service. So if it rains in the Sukkah, it would be wrong for us to stay there. Rather, we must leave immediately, since Hashem has shown that He's not pleased with our mitzvah. The Eibusher should bench us, that we should be zeichet to be mekayim all His mitzvahs beratzon.